Today on Inspired Money.
It was a little bit of a stretch at times, I think, because I think about 300 pages in, I think a few people were like, well, this is so removed from football, what's it got to do with it? But I wanted to show that, this is an interconnected world, and you can't take this guy's story and not connect it to your football club. He is absolutely fundamental to how the person who bought your club made their money and retains their position.
This is episode 14 with journalist and author of the Billionaires Club, James Montague. Welcome to Inspired Money. My name is Andy Wong, a managing partner at Runnymede Capital Management. Each week we bring you an interesting person to help you get inspired, shift your perspectives on money, and achieve incredible things. From making it to giving it away, Inspired Money means making a difference, creating something bigger than oneself, and maybe, just maybe, making the world a better place. Thank you for joining me. The show notes for this week's episode can be found at inspiredmoney.fm/014. Inspired Money is brought to you by my company, Runnymede Capital Management. We help clients to plan, invest, and worry less. Whether you're trying to build wealth or planning for retirement, we're here to help. Get to know us better and educate yourself for free by subscribing to our blog at inspiredmoney.fm. Do you like soccer? Do you like football? Do you like football? Do you like soccer? Today we're going to use the two terms interchangeably, and we're going to talk about a whole lot more. A new study by Credit Suisse revealed that the richest 1% of the world's population owns over half the wealth. That's up from 42.5% during the 2008 financial crisis to 50.1% in 2017. Today we're going to explore this subject, but we're going to explore it through the lens of soccer. We're going to talk to James Montague, author of the Billionaires Club, The Unstoppable Rise of Football's Super Rich Owners. In his research, he crisscrossed the world, from Dhaka to Doha, from China to Crewe, from St. Louis to London, from Bangkok to Belgium, to profile this new elite, their network of money, and their influence that defies geographic boundaries. In this episode, you'll learn 1. How the ownership of soccer clubs is changing, 2. The power of money in politics, and 3. Insight into the world's billionaires from the US, Europe, Middle East, and China. Now let's get inspired talking to author James Montague. James, it's so great to have you on Inspired Money.
Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
Mainly not having any of it. But I grew up in England, in the southeast of England with, we didn't grow up in abject poverty or anything, but I always remember money being tight and really never having any of it. But I can actually really remember the first sight of money I ever had, that was mine. And that was when, my first tooth came out, and I must have been 4, maybe 3, and being told that there was this thing called the tooth fairy. And if I put my tooth under the pillow, I would get money. And money was something that wasn't mine up to that point. It was just something that parents had. Things arrived in the house somehow through some kind of transactional arrangement that I didn't know about. And there it was. I remember it was a very sunny day, blinding sunlight, and it was shining directly on this 50p piece, which in American money, I suppose, is about 30 cents or something. And actually, no, it's probably more than that. It's probably about 75 cents. It's the other way around, isn't it? So it's about 75 cents. And it was just, I remember to this day how vivid it was. It was just shining off this 50p piece. And so that was kind of my first ever money, and the first time I ever kind of saw money, that I can remember money. It's a very wholesome memory. And I think that the tooth fairy has experienced quite a bit of inflation since then. I would think so. I've got a 2-year-old now, and she's got incredible teeth, and so I know they're going to come out eventually. So I'm going to have to find out what the going rate is.
That's right. The tooth fairy is coming.
Tooth Fairy is coming, but I don't know, because I live in Serbia, so do I give it to her in dinars? She's a Dutch citizen. Maybe I give it to her in euros. Do I give it to her in pounds because I'm English? So I'm into the 21st century.
That's right.
And global. Or Bitcoin. Maybe that's what it'll be. I'd have to give it to her in Bitcoin.
Even better.
Or some other cryptocurrency.
You have to select which one. You have to choose very wisely. Yeah. James, you've been called the Indiana Jones of football writing. And you mentioned to me that I think you've covered 80 countries. So you have tremendous perspective. Who did you write this book for, The Billionaires Club?
Mainly, I had quite an interesting reaction to it when it came out. I mean, when I wrote it mainly as a warning's probably the wrong word, but there was a spate of purchases of soccer clubs in the UK. And when my first book came out, When Friday Comes, it kind of covers the Middle East. I go to every Middle Eastern country and try to kind of do a little bit what kind of Franklin Furr did, with How Soccer Explains the World, is to try to explain the Middle East through soccer. And one of the places I knew very well was the United Arab Emirates, and especially Dubai. I lived there for 3 years. And when my book came out, suddenly Manchester City, which is a huge football club, but kind of not downing on its luck exactly, but hadn't had a lot of success in the past kind of 20 odd years, had been bought by a member of the Abu Dhabi royal family, and this guy Sheikh Mansour, was a complete unknown to almost everybody, and it was, for me, having lived in the Middle East and knowing exactly what the setup was in the UAE, and certainly when it came to things like where that money would have come from, how the economy is set up there, what the human rights situation is like there, what the rule of law is like, there were some quite troubling questions, whereas most people were like, this is great. This is this guy who's super rich, filthy rich, he's a billionaire. He wants to spend money on a football or a soccer club. He wants to do that, for ego and all these things. And that's a really great thing. And I was like, hang on a second, this is actually a bit more problematic about where this money came from. So the genesis of the idea came from that, really. It was the idea of trying to find out about the money, but not necessarily in a kind of Paradise Papers kind of way where you're kind of like tracing back, back to kind of, this kind of network of cash, which I find quite difficult to write about, but about the human interest, the human stories of the people who have kind of lost out as these people have risen to power. So that was the idea, and the people it's kind of for, I think, is for people who don't really know about who these people are who come to buy their soccer club. So that they're kind of soccer fans, but also people who are just interested in the world, but people who, essentially are fans of the game and have been, and have kind of understood that soccer clubs aren't really businesses. They're not like franchises in the US, like you have with the NFL. These are kind of community organizations that have existed for generations, passed down usually the support through families, from grandfather to father to son. And that, the influx of this money could have quite a kind of, I think, a kind of corrosive effect on what's a really unique social and cultural thing that the English have kind of popularized around the world, and which we're kind of killing with over commercialization.
Can you just, for our listeners, take us quickly through a little historical perspective of football ownership? Because I know that it goes way back historically, and then changes really started to surface maybe in 2003.
I mean, traditionally, soccer clubs, there's been a bit, when it comes to English football in particular, and we're the first country or the first kind of place that kind of codifies the game before and gives the world the rules of soccer. I mean, there's still a debate about where soccer was invented. The Chinese have a good claim. I mean, there's some good claims in South America, but we're the first people in the kind of mid-19th century that really kind of codify the game. And those are the rules by which the game is largely still played. And we're still the custodians. British FA is still the custodians of that. And when on the European continent, a lot of clubs were kind of connected to government departments, and so connected to kind of state entities. And in England, what happened was limited liability companies came into effect, which basically meant that you could start a corporation and take money borrow money. And if the business failed, it was the business that was responsible for it and not you personally. And this was something that was latched onto by football clubs at a very early stage, really from 1888 onwards, where that money would be used to pay for stadiums. And so that's why you have this network of incredible stadiums around England, mainly built in kind of working class areas. I mean, this was a working class sport, but it wasn't necessarily a business. It was something that the early investors were usually kind of local businessmen who'd done well, kind of bought a club, that was good for the community. There was a philanthropic element to it. Of course, there was always, as TV money grew, as gate receipts grew, as merchandising grew, as commercial kind of deals started growing, money did start coming into the game, and it attracted characters who wanted to make a profit from it. But really, what changes is there's two things that happen really in 1989. One of them is the fall of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which sparks off a series of events that eventually leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which really starts this kind of march towards the kind of super rich, where millionaires become billionaires, where there is, this capitalism has kind of won the day. And so you have this rise of oligarchy that comes out of it, but there are fortunes to be made, and 89 is the year where that kind of becomes a kind of global ideology. But also in 1989, you had the Hillsborough disaster in England, where at an FA Cup match, 96 Liverpool fans were killed, crushed to death because effectively mismanagement by the police, but also the treatment of fans in these very old Victorian grounds meant that they were kind of treated like cattle, and so there was this very much a kind of inward-looking kind of reform process after that, like how do we prevent this from happening? And English football was completely revolutionised, and the Premier League was started, a kind of breakaway league. It was kind of revamped. You had to have all-seater stadiums. And the money started flowing into the game. And with the TV and with the technological kind of help of cable television and also of the internet, that spread English Premier League football around the world and attracted this new money, which had been started to be made in Eastern Europe and in Asia and Africa in certain respects, South America, but in America as well. All this money, people for various different reasons could see that English football was good for their brand, was good for their for changing their reputations, and then in the end, changing the reputations of whole companies. So what you have is this money coming in. No, it's not really a business that anybody would want to invest in for profit yet, because the margins are very small, high revenue, but small margins. And then in 2003, you have Roman Abramovich, who is a Putin-aligned, Vladimir Putin-aligned, the president of Russia, oligarch, who has enriched himself in this post-Soviet fire sale of assets, firstly aligned to Yeltsin and later with Vladimir Putin, who basically buys Chelsea Football Club, has no connection to it whatsoever, but spends hundreds of millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of dollars to achieve success for Chelsea, a club that had never really experienced much success in its career, and completely revolutionised the club. And this creates a revolution in English football, because before you've had a few very wealthy people like Jack Walker at Blackburn Rovers who had come in and bought the club and bankrolled them to the championship. But this was different, because this now meant there was an arms race of other clubs looking for their own billionaires to fund their own expansion. And that brought the game to people like the Glazers, for instance. It brought the game to Sheikh Mansour of Manchester City, again, somebody who's almost a trillionaire rather than the billionaire. So you can see how it's changed. It's changed from, you have like the Edwards family who bought Manchester United shares in the 1960s. I mean, this is a family of butchers, bought those shares and cleverly then leveraged them in the end to kind of, make some profit out of it. But essentially local businessmen kind of agitating to get the best profit out of the situation. So now where you have, oligarchs, you have whole states when it comes to kind of Chinese controlled business interests investing in soccer. When you have, actual states like directly investing, if you look at what happens with the United Arab Emirates and Manchester City, and also with Qatar and Paris Saint-Germain in the French division, because this isn't something that's just happened in English football. This is happening across Europe. across Asia and also in America. And all these connections are coming together as you would expect in a kind of globalized economy.
Well, I think it's fascinating that your book, it's looking through a lens of the sport of football, but there are many themes that are commentary on what's going on in the world. I'm assuming that you come at this being a hardcore football fan, right? This is your fourth book, I think, and it seems like each one is soccer or football related, taking a very interesting spin topic-wise.
I am a soccer fan, but I started off writing about politics. And so for me, I've tried to connect the two. So actually, when I look through most of the books I've written, and they have all been kind of loosely based on soccer, but actually, when you get down to it, there's very little soccer in there. There's very few soccer matches that I describe.
Interesting.
And I worked out quite early that my skill isn't necessarily describing soccer matches, which is a very particular skill and one which a lot of people are losing. But it's usually what happens before and after the game. And so, I've kind of focused on different areas. The first book was about the Middle East, so it was kind of an area. The second one was about, there's two versions of that book, but then the third one is about the 31 Nil, which is about underdogs in world football trying to qualify for the World Cup. So that's something completely different. And it was to me that money was such a fundamental, and the change in how money is made and what's being done to it and how it's changing football was for me absolutely something that I had to write about next. And I tried to apply that same principle that football and soccer in particular is a fantastic lens to look at social and political issues and economic issues too, increasingly so. And so, I've kind of used piggyback the game and tried to write kind of political books out of it, but it's just soccer as the lens for it. And this book isn't necessarily about soccer. It's also about the kind of change in the world economy. It's about inequality. It's about slavery. It's about a lot of issues that you don't necessarily. If you look at other industries like the clothing industry, or kind of fast food, or 21st century farming, these kind of things. These are kind of well-worn paths to examining the kind of state of play when it comes to the 21st century globalized economy. And I thought you could do that with football as well, with soccer. And so, as I discovered, it was a pretty, interesting way to look at it, because if you're a sports writer, a lot of the time people still think you're an idiot. So if you're a soccer writer, I found that, often I couldn't get. I remember I was in Haiti doing a story for 31 Nil about the Haiti national team. And it was, I think his name was Michel Martelly, the former president of Haiti. And there was no way I would have got an interview with him, except for the fact that there was a World Cup qualifier on. And I said, I'm here for the World Cup qualifier. Can I talk to you about football? Because he was really using that match as a way to kind of shore up his support. And trying to kind of rally around the flag effect, and so I found that I've got interviews with statesmen and kind of leading politicians and kind of analysts off the back of them, thinking, he's a football writer. What does he know? So it's
right, tremendous access. But I'm sure that you got to see some good matches. I did.
I've also seen some absolutely incredible games and things that are really off the beaten track. I was talking the other day about one of them, and something I'll never forget. So I was in Samoa, which is an independent sovereign nation, but next door is American Samoa, which is the unincorporated territory, I think it is, of the US. But also, interesting fact, produces more servicemen and NFL players per capita than anywhere else in the US, which is shows you that there's not much else to do there apart from, become an American footballer or join the army. But they famously lost a game. American Samoa lost a game 31 Nil. And so I tracked down the team as they were playing a World Cup qualifier, and they'd never won a game, never scored a goal. And I was there. There was like 25 fans watching this game in Apia, the capital of Samoa. And I watched them win their first ever game, and the players were crying, and it was just wonderful. There's a film actually that was made about that game called "Next Goal Wins," which I recommend all your listeners to listen to. But I've seen football matches everywhere. So although I use finance or politics or anything to look into football issues, and football issues to look into those issues as well. I do get to see some really interesting football matches as well.
As I read through your book, it really became clear in reading about this Billionaires Club how inextricably intertwined like money and political power are. It didn't matter if it was in the United States, where you write about some of the American like NFL team owners and using tax dollars to build stadiums, or going to other countries. It just seems like you write a lot about Russia and the oligarchs. The politics are very much a part of this wealthy class.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, politics is a tool that's used by the super rich to either first to get their fortunes, then secondly to keep their fortunes. And what you find is that this billionaires club, like, just people who are billionaires, when you get to that level, they're actually very similar, and they kind of act in a very similar way, and they go to the same places on holiday, and they have property in the same places. London is effectively, it's like buying gold. You buy London real estate, you park your money there, whether you are a American franchise owner or a kind of Azerbaijani kind of criminal, and that's kind of these kind of people will move in the same circles, and they use politics. They all use politics, but they use it in different ways. And you can see how, if you have money, obviously it gives you a certain amount of power. But in the Russia system, where it's a lot more opaque, and now what's been, I think it's called the political oligarchy. I think it's been described. That you have people originally obtain their fortunes kind of under the Yeltsin regime, when he was desperate to get elected because it looked like a communist might come into power in the second presidential election and then undo all the gains of freedom and all the gains of free market reform. So basically did a deal with a lot of very wealthy people in Russia, or people who wanted to be wealthy, that if you keep me in power, if you manage to give me money so that I can, buy adverts and kind of fund my war chest for the campaign, I will then, allow you the loan for shares program, which basically gave kind of non-competitive tenders to all sorts of government businesses, especially oil, zinc, kind of natural wealth, stuff like that. So these people took advantage of a weak state, of a weak political system to make their money. And then when Putin comes in, he basically sets up a system where it's like, you do what I say, don't have political ambition, or I'll take your money away. So they're kind of being used now. They're being used by the political system. If there's something that needs to be paid for, if there's money that needs to be moved, they have to do his bidding, so they know who's the boss. Whereas in the US, they're using, this is a well-worn and well-developed political system, but it's always whoever's the wealthiest has the best lawyers and can navigate it best. So you have this insane system where franchise owners, it doesn't matter what sport it is, and you can see this now with MLS, even with new soccer expansion franchises, of demanding government subsidies, state subsidies, hundreds of billions of subsidies going into the pockets, literally, of the richest 1% of the 1%. And there's a great guy called Neil DeMause, who I recommend your listeners really read. He wrote a book called A Field of Schemes, which is also a great title for a book, where he kind of details, and he's got a great website and blog as well, where he kind of regularly updates about this scandal of how the billionaire class in the US is kind of robbing state coffers. Some of them, one in particular, Stan Kroenke, and I follow this in the book, how he's basically the majority owner of Arsenal Football Club, which is one of the most storied soccer clubs in England. But your American listeners will know him well for being, the owner of the St. Louis Rams, but now the Los Angeles Rams. And St. Louis is a down at heel city. And this guy was demanding hundreds of millions of pounds of subsidies to rebuild the stadium that was, it was only 20 years old anyway. But because it had written in the contract, it said, well, if you don't give us this money, we'll move the stadium, we'll move the franchise elsewhere, and you won't have anything. And I was speaking to activists who are saying, we've got hospitals who do not have lifts, elevators working. They haven't worked for 10 years. and you're asking for hundreds of millions. In the end, he moved the franchise to LA where he'd make a lot more money, trash the city.
To the dismay of an entire city.
To the dismay of the entire city. But it was absolutely shameless that this is expected now. I think something is changing. I mean, the one good thing about the Trump presidency, I think, is that actually one of the things that this, and especially this NFL argument that's happening with the owners and all this kind of stuff, and the knee and Colin Kaepernick, is that the issue of state subsidies for these owners of franchises might be coming to an end. There might be a kind of political kind of will now. And I've been looking for very small reasons to think there might be anything good that comes out of the Trump presidency. But if there's the only thing I've come across is that's not a bad thing,
It seems narrow, but it's good to have something.
Well, you've got to have something. Otherwise you go crazy.
Well, you call this the unstoppable rise. Do you think that is this a trend that is reversible, or is it not?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it is. I think, not just in soccer, not just in sport, but in the world. I look at the kind of rise of inequality, the way that the super rich are basically dismantling the kind of entitlements that tax pay for in a state system, which I know this is slightly controversial to say this, but if you look at some of the best performing states in the world, places like, Scandinavian countries, if you look at kind of Germany, the Netherlands, that have strong systems in place.
Social systems.
If you fall on hard times, there is a way that you can be picked up. You are a functioning member of society. Finland have been looking at kind of minimum income, for instance. If you think that the schooling system and going to college, healthcare, that these things are free or heavily subsidized, that you get the best out of every member of your society, no matter what their background is, no matter how good their parents are, it doesn't matter. If they're an idiot, they're not going to progress that much, But if you're good, if you're talented, having a true meritocracy. The problem is that the super rich are dismantling that. And you can see that with the Paradise Papers right now. And the way they're dismantling it, not just changing the law so that they can, kind of minimize their tax bills, but even if they do change the law, that they can minimize them anywhere by setting up a kind of complex system of offshore businesses to bamboozle the regulators who will never have the money or the time or the resources. You're going to have fairly destructive governments. We can see this already with, the election of Trump is one example, but also we have the rise of the far right in Europe, the rise of kind of far right nationalism. That if you let the super rich dismantle these states and these systems, and poor people get poorer, they will turn towards very simple solutions, and very simple people to blame, which are immigrants, different groups within society. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this, is that we didn't heed this warning 20 years ago. People were marching on the streets in the end of the 1990s saying, watch out for globalization. We need constraints on globalization. We don't want the rise of corporate power. This is a scary thing that's going to happen. And you know what? They were right. That's exactly what's happened. And every year we don't realize that that corporations, when it comes to the sovereignty of a state, pose a greater threat than say like a European Union type superstate which regulates for things, or governments which can regulate within an economy. Then I think we're going down a fairly kind of dystopian path.
And those lines get blurred too when you're talking about ownership of football clubs, because it's not only individuals, it is corporations. And then in some cases, those corporations are part of states or very closely connected to the countries.
That's absolutely true. I mean, in a lot of the cases, the dirty secret of soccer club ownership as well is who is really owning that soccer club. We've had this come out with the Paradise Papers. One of the things that, when I was going through this book, and there are things you can't write because for one, you're writing about the richest people in the world, so you have to be very careful where you are legally. But the other one is that there are several question marks that you have about who is the ultimate beneficial owner of this football club, of this soccer club, of this franchise. And there were so many question marks about that. And one of the things that's come out of the Paradise Papers was that Alisher Usmanov, who was a character I write about, he's this Uzbek-born oligarch, very close links with Putin, was basically the guy that turned Gazprom into the political weapon, the state gas giant that's an oil giant that's basically this political weapon that's being used against the states that surround it. And he has a percentage of Arsenal Football Club, who wants to have more of it, but it hasn't really worked out for him because nobody wants him to have a seat on the board. But he had a deal with Fahad Mashiri, who's an Iranian British businessman, and they own shares together in Arsenal, and he sold those shares to Usmanov, and then he goes and buys another club called Everton with this £500 million that he gets. And what comes out in the Paradise Papers is that Usmanov essentially gives him the money to buy the shares in Arsenal in the first place, and then gives him £500 million to buy the shares off him. So the entire thing looks like it's a gift from Usmanov, and it looks like that he may well be the ultimate beneficial owner of the club. And it's this. How regulators can't find that out. There aren't people there who have the resources to look into it. You're reliant essentially on the press, which is an institution which is under incredible financial stress and pressure because there isn't really a proper model to replace the kind of advertising model of that kind of started falling apart in the 1990s. And then other than that, you are kind of dependent on the goodwill and also the kind of moral fiber of people within some of these organizations that have this data to leak it. So it's, you're in some, it's a pretty difficult situation to be in, to find out, who actually owns the clubs, who's actually controlling the clubs, and who and for what reason. And even if you look at Manchester City and Sheikh Mansour and the royal family of Abu Dhabi, it's an information black box. Once you get into a kind of opaque monarchy in the Middle East, the information stops. There's no public disclosure. There's no reason to publish anything. It's not like there are checks and balances in that place. That's it. Who knows what's going on in there when it comes to? I mean, we can take a guess in some respects because some of the people who are involved in Manchester City are also involved in the running of, some of the biggest sovereign investment vehicles there, in some of the big building projects there, and we can kind of piece it together. But it's really, I feel sometimes it's just circling the edge of what's really going on.
Yeah, with Sheikh Mansour, I understand he has not done interviews in England. He's only attended one game. He sees his ownership as a sound business investment. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about his case and your story about how you ended up in Bangladesh doing research for your book?
Well, in a way, Sheikh Mansour is kind of my way into this because he's the one that makes me think this is the Billionaires Club. We need to tell the stories of these people because nobody knows, and nobody knows where the money comes from. And when he buys Manchester City in 2008, because nobody knows anything about him, he's sold as this kind of young, very wealthy member of the royal family, but not really involved in politics, but, very wealthy. And he wants to buy a football club because, he wants something to do. He wants a challenge. And then you look at it and you think, well, he's in charge of one of the kind of biggest sovereign investment vehicles in the United Arab Emirates. He's just made billions of dollars profit by basically shifting Barclays shares, because obviously after the banking collapse in 2008, the British banking sector needed to be recapitalised. And what happened was Barclays Bank, owned by two brothers who are extremely conservative, own a conservative paper, big donors to the Conservative Party, tax exiles, did not want to then have a kind of be somehow beholden to the government. And so they went cap in hand to Middle Eastern investors. And so Sheikh Mansour was one of them who made an absolutely massive profit, billions and billions of pounds. I was still unsure whether it was his personal profit or if it was for his investment, a sovereign investment vehicle. But the issue was that the profit was so huge that the idea that you would buy a football club to somehow also make the profit. I mean, for instance, the margins are tiny. Now we're talking maybe 500 million revenue a year in pounds, and maybe making 10 to 12 million pounds profit off it. I mean, this isn't something that is for the amount of work. And most of that money that goes out of the system is wages. I mean, it's a huge wages to turnover ratio when it comes to soccer clubs. So the idea that he's investing in it for money, I think, is ridiculous. And then he comes in, he spends a silly amount of money turning Manchester City into this hugely successful soccer club. I mean, they're in the Champions League, which is this big European league, which is the wealthiest league, basically. They win the title, they win the kind of the big, it comes to pass that every dream that every Manchester City fan wants comes true. But then you look at who is running that club. You don't see him there. You don't see. He never goes to the games. He never does interviews. But it's the chairman of the club is Khaldoon Al Mubarak, who is closely aligned to Mohammed bin Zayed, who's basically in charge of the security apparatus of the United Arab Emirates. And has been implicated in all sorts of human rights abuses because you have arbitrary detention in the United Arab Emirates, you have widespread torture within prisons, you have people having their citizenship taken away from them as a method of punishment. There's a law now that basically stops people from saying anything online on social media, or you'll be put in jail for 2 to 5 years. And for me, when you saw who these people were and the projects they were involved in, so they would be, for instance, Khaldoon Al Mubarak, as well as being on the board of Manchester City, being the chairman of Manchester City, would also be on the board of NYU, and was driving a project to have an NYU campus built in Abu Dhabi because they want to have the impression that they are an outward, open-minded place where you could study and you could, you've had the Louvre has just opened there. You've got all these sort of institutions are opening up branches there. They're funded by these petrodollars. But the entire thing is built on kind of Asian workers who are exploited, being paid $200, $300 a month in terrible conditions. They're not allowed to unionize, often tortured if they do try to unionize. Then they're deported. And I wanted to get to the bottom of where the money comes from in the United Arab Emirates. Because if you get to the bottom of that, then you get to the bottom of Sheikh Mansour's fortune. Because nothing is given, nothing is earned in the UAE if you're part of the elite. This is all state cash, and there are two things that are at the root of the success of the United Arab Emirates. One of them is Abu Dhabi's oil, because it's Abu Dhabi rather than the other 6 Emirates that have all the oil, and the other one is the workers, the 80% of the country that aren't, that from the kind of South and Southeast Asia, who build these amazing buildings and build the infrastructure for that country. At rock bottom prices, in the most appalling conditions. And so for me to understand, I tracked one of the workers who worked on the NYU site and was deported, was tortured, and was sent back to Bangladesh. And I wanted to basically speak to them, but then follow the trail back to Abu Dhabi and understand this global business that's basically exploiting labor. From the poorest place in the world, getting it to the Middle East, and you have all of these people complicit in it by benefiting from it. So it was a little bit of a stretch at times, I think, because I think about 300 pages in, I think a few people were like, "Well, this is so removed from football. What's it got to do with it?" But I wanted to show that this is an interconnected world. And you can't take this guy's story and not connect it to your football club. He is absolutely fundamental to how the person who bought your club made their money and retains their position. And so, it was, and you have other people. There's a member of the Manchester City board, for instance, who is, has been in meetings with British ministers threatening to have kind of deals worth hundreds of billions of pounds for jet fighters be cancelled if they don't change their foreign policy in certain ways. So you can see that the very top people involved in decision making in Abu Dhabi are involved in Manchester City. So why buy Manchester City? And of course, Manchester City softens their image. It's reputation laundering. That's effectively what this is. This is about changing the reputation of the United Arab Emirates, which have done very successfully, to make it look like a forward-looking, open-minded, Western-style, safe place to do business in the Middle East, in a neighbourhood known for having a lot of trouble. And actually, what they're doing to do that is fundamentally, I think, bad, but they're managing to convince people that they're not by this kind of network of business interests around Manchester City, which is if you want to send a message around the world, whether it's your business, whether it's a product, whether it's your country, nothing does that better than the soccer club. Nothing. And so, it's just a fantastic way to launder your reputation.
So everybody has different motivations, it sounds like. Stan Kroenke, I'm assuming that maybe he's trying to take some of the U.S. business practices when it comes to running a sports franchise and bringing that to soccer. I know that you speculated that Roman Abramovich may have entered ownership of a soccer team because it's a way for him to protect his assets. And then in this case, for the UAE, it's reputational.
Well, there is, for me, I found it's slightly geographical. Where the billionaire comes from usually is a good indicator for how they made their money, and two, what their kind of end game is. And you're right, with Stan Kroenke, I think it is about profit, because and profit is relative, let's put it that way. Somebody could be happy selling something, making £100 profit, but for other people, making £1 billion profit is a loss. And so you find that with the real super rich, with the trillionaires, which is why I don't buy this, like Middle Eastern royalty are interested in making a profit. That's not what they're about. But for American franchise owners, when you're talking about tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds, that is something that they are interested in making a profit on. Because if you think about it, everybody that's investing heavily in English and European soccer right now, they all cut their teeth on US franchise ownership and the US franchise ownership model. And so they have seen you can only go so far with the NFL. Okay, it is the most valuable sports league in the world, mainly fueled by ever increasing TV deals. But TV deals might be changing. You've got cord cutters. I mean, the NFL had a big slump in kind of viewership figures. I mean, the Premier League too has as well. But soccer is a genuine global phenomenon. NFL doesn't have much expansion outside of American borders. Soccer does have a huge potential. Look at China, look at India. I mean, even look at the US itself.
James, can you talk a little bit about China?
I can talk a little bit. Yeah.
It's just been such a exponential or parabolic rise.
It has been, and I was in China last year to kind of do something about it. So when I started the book, actually, China wasn't in the book because China hadn't really got involved in the kind of there'd been some growth in the Chinese Super League, but mainly most of us could remember 2002 when China qualified for its first World Cup, and there was a kind of Chinese soccer boom then. People were desperate to go out there and play in China. They could see this huge 1.3 billion market, get Chinese players to come to the Premier League. And if we get them in the Premier League, then that opens up this whole market. But the whole thing effectively collapsed because of corruption in China. There was huge bribes being paid by teams to referees. There was corruption within the Chinese FAs, that you had players having to pay bribes to play for the national team. And the entire thing was basically destroyed. Betting companies were involved. And so people turned to the NBA, where you had Yao Ming, who Houston Rockets was a genuinely world-class basketball player. In soccer, they didn't have anything because they had essentially corruption had destroyed the league and destroyed the national team. So this kind of came up on a little bit kind of by surprise, and mainly because Xi Jinping, the premier who's supposed to be consolidating his power more and more, is a massive soccer fan. And so he kind of commissions this report, which basically sets a plan for how China will be a leading figure within the sports and sports marketing, the sports business in the world by 2050. And part of that is getting China to a World Cup. It's hosting a World Cup and maybe one day winning a World Cup. And so this was essentially the Chinese state, the Communist Party, saying, this is what want you to do. You go and do it. And of course, they have a slightly capitalistic system there. I don't know whether you would call it a slightly communist system or a slightly capitalistic system there, but certainly it's a state regulated, state controlled system. And so this kind of green light was then followed by patriotic billionaires going out and buying these huge amount of assets all around Europe. Usually they had no background whatsoever in sports marketing or soccer club ownership, but they bought, just clubs all across. You have Wolverhampton Wanderers. Most of the West Midlands in England have been bought by Chinese clubs. For the Billionaires Club, I focused on ADO Den Haag, a Dutch club that was bought by Chinese. Not a billionaire, but certainly a very wealthy investor.
Was that the guy who disappeared? I didn't quite follow that story.
Yeah, he disappears.
I didn't understand what happened to that guy. He
disappears, and then he kind of like comes back. And eventually, at the end of the book, he is removed from the board because either he didn't quite understand that the Dutch have a system that you have to do, like being wealthy isn't enough to throw your money around. Dutch have rules, a regulatory system that if you don't have the money in place before the start of the season, then they kind of run the finances of the football club for you. And so this guy was was such a bad owner that they basically removed him as chairman. But the Chinese money is still there, and he still kind of, the company that was behind him kind of still runs it. But that was an example for me of what happens when you just have any old Chinese company picking any old football club. You have one like Espanyol, for instance, which was bought by Rasta, which is essentially a car manufacturer, a toy car manufacturer in China. It moved into the club ownership system. So you have all these things going around, but the issue that's now happening. There's a really good investigation today by Tariq Panja and other New York Times journalists about what's happened to the owner of AC Milan, who bought the club. A Chinese guy. Very few people knew about who he was, and he had some mining contracts, but very few people knew. But once you look into it, the entire house of cards crumbles. He doesn't look like he has a business or any money. He's kind of borrowed very high interest rate loan to buy one of the biggest soccer clubs in the world, AC Milan. Things aren't going well on the pitch, and if they don't qualify for the Champions League, he's going to have struggled to pay that loan back, which means that the club are going to be teetering towards bankruptcy, which is kind of one of the things that happened to ADO Den Haag. And you can see the Chinese state now is kind of cracking down at the end of last year because you had so much money leaving the country that they've now kind of put a brake on people buying sporting assets abroad, because the suspicion in the Chinese authorities was that people were using it to get money out of China. And they want, with this Belt and Road Initiative, to take as much money back into China, into the infrastructure projects to help the country grow. But people were using it, okay, yeah, we'll do this. I'll buy this asset that I don't know anything about, but it's a good way to get a couple of $100 million out of the country. So, this China thing has been crazy, especially the growth in the local league and these wages they're paying for these big international soccer players to come over. But I suspect that we might be seeing the end of it because, we're going to start seeing a lot of these clubs go to the wall. I suspect AC Milan are in a lot of trouble with this guy. And so, there's going to be a lot of clubs going to the wall. And clearly the Chinese authorities have recognized that this is something that needs to be cooled down. So if we look back at this in 5 years' time, I bet it will just be a little bit like 2002 and the kind of flash of interest in soccer in China then. It might be the same.
You may have a sequel to the Billionaires Club. All these stories seem very complex and very much like a soap opera in many cases. I imagine this was a difficult book to write, even in what you were able to capture.
Oh, it was a very difficult book to write. And even when I finished it, I kept on thinking, because every day some other club was being bought, or there was another story that I would uncover, or there'd be a leak of financial data that would point in a different direction to something that I was working on. So I kept on having to go back to my publisher, my agent, saying, look, for one, I had to go back to China. I had to go to China. Right. And
I need to add China.
I need to add China. And they're like, it's not like you're adding Liechtenstein. Actually, no, Liechtenstein has a complex economic system anyway, because of all the tax stuff going on there. Iceland, China is a country, it's a continent on its own. So So I had to kind of add all these things in, and I can't remember who said it, but it says that kind of a book isn't finished by an author; it's taken away from them. And I felt that that's what happened here with this one. It's like they said, "Look, just give it to us," and it had to be kind of wrested from my cold dead hands because I could have just added and added and added. And I suspect if there's a second edition, which I hope there will be, there's going to be other stories that I really want to delve into. I mean, there are stories in Africa that I'd like to have done a bit more, and a little bit more about South America. And I've got a feeling that this China story is going to have a kind of fairly unhappy ending, and I suspect that might be the next story of kind of billionaire owners.
So James, do you dare speculate about the future of football? I mean, from the spectator's perspective, so much has changed. The rising cost to attend the matches, just the commercialization. What happens down the line?
Well, I've been thinking about this and where this goes. And, one of the things I think that's going to be probably more immediate is, this is going to be bigger and bigger, I think, although, TV deals, it depends on one thing, TV deals. If this kind of blip in viewership is down to just changes in the way people consume sport. So people are still watching sport in the same way, but they might be watching it on their phone or on their computers rather than watching it on television. Then that's something that can be monetized. That will be something you're going to have big. And we've already seen this. There's been a big deal with Amazon and Manchester City to, I think it was for £10 million to have a kind of a behind the scenes TV program done. Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, other social media are going to be bidding for these rights, not just traditional right holders. And we'll see that, I think, as well with international corporations like competitions like the World Cup. So if the money keeps flowing, then this will keep getting to this position where the money, wages, expensive tickets, this kind of destruction of the original concept of what a football club is will continue at a pace. The thing is, I don't think that it is sustainable from the grassroots up, because one of the things that soccer is, and if you look at the kind of the adverts for, when I was in New York recently, and you see the way they sell soccer to like a TV audience, there's some flash images like edited together, kind of Bourne style of people playing football, but actually most of those are of the crowd, like an English kind of passionate crowds, cheering on their team, because this is kind of an alien concept. I mean, I know you've got college sports and college football. People really, they have a team for life, which is probably the closest comparison to kind of English Premier League soccer teams. But it's, that where that came from, where that passion, where that visual comes from, is by having kind of, it's a kind of working class culture, people living in their vicinities, cheap tickets of young people to go together and sing together at these matches. And that is being destroyed because young people don't go and play football. There's a BBC price of football investigation yesterday that was released that most people under the age of 25, they don't interact with football as a game that they play or go and watch because they've been priced out. So they bet on it, or they play it online on football games, on the FIFA and things like that. So you're losing a whole generation. And what I think will be the wake-up call is when this demographic time bomb takes place, when all the people who are in their 50s and 60s now, who fell in love with the game and could afford season tickets, but they fell in love with the game when it was cheap and easy to go, and it was a game that was for the masses and not just for the wealthy. When they eventually hang up their season tickets, there's going to be nobody behind them. I mean, clubs hope that there will be tourists that come in and replace them, but that only works in a certain kind of, Arsenal will be fine, I'm sure. Right. Manchester United will be fine. But
it's not sustainable.
But it's not sustainable for the rest of the club. So you either have a kind of complete collapse in, kind of attendances, which isn't, massively big for the bottom line of a club, but for the health of what the visuals, for the health of the club as an institution that people love, that is ruinous. Or it could go the other way, and you'll have essentially, two tiers. You'd have the super rich clubs, which you just say, okay, if you want to have your own Super League, you do it. And they become these kind of like Harlem Globetrotters of soccer around the world, playing in a global Super League with Guangzhou Evergrande in China. And then you have these national leagues that just, focus very much on fan-owned clubs and keep that kind of very local culture alive, which is another option. But I look at a system like Germany, where you have a 50+1 system, where it's impossible for kind of one shareholder to own the majority of the club, making it unattractive to kind of big money investors like you see in English football. If there's one thing I would say, bring in a regulatory framework like that. Look at it; it's brilliant. The stadiums are full, the tickets are cheap, the football's good. You have the national team, the best in the world. And that proves that you don't have to have this kind of ruinous capitalistic system that profit will necessarily lead to success on the pitch. I think that, they're in danger of killing the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right. Which is what happened in the financial crisis when you talk about the corporations and the big banks. Yeah,
exactly.
In writing this book and studying the Billionaires Club so closely, were your conclusions as expected, or did anything surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, my original conclusion was very upbeat, because I went to Portsmouth FC. I went to this is a football club, a very storied old English soccer club, who had, Icarus style, flown too close to the sun, had 5 kind of super rich foreign owners over the course of 4 years, and they had destroyed the club. They were the first Premier League club to be put into administration, and they had fallen, down into the 4th tier of English football. And the club was bought by the fans. And this was one thing that I thought would be the conclusion, is that fan-owned clubs are the future. We don't know how far they can be scaled up. I mean, I think you've got the only fan-owned entity I can think of in the US, probably the Green Bay Packers. And the NFL certainly aren't going to allow any more Green Bay Packers to enter the system. But fan-owned clubs, there's a few of them now, and this kind of fan-owned supporters trust movement has been, something that really emerged over the past 2 decades, has been emerging in the lower leagues as a really viable model that allows you, it's not just a kind of like a wishy-washy socialist utopian thinking, that you can actually compete with clubs and get promotion and hold your own on a sporting sense as well. Because, I mean, if you have the Moneyball way of looking at things, it's your wages, the amount of wages you pay is directly applicable, directly relevant to what success you get. But that's kind of turned it a little bit on its head, and having this fan ownership model has been great for Portsmouth. I mean, they saved the club from relegation, then they got promotion, and you had a full stadium, people really proud of the team again. So that was my conclusion. My conclusion was, okay, you might not get into the Champions League, but a fan-owned club will save the club, and it will be recognisable to you. And it's about tempering expectations of what your club can do. But then I handed the book in, and then I get a call from some contacts of mine in Portsmouth, and you have Michael Eisner, the former CEO of Disney, swoops in and decides that he wants, another kind of, he wants to soccer Mighty Ducks and wants to buy Portsmouth. And
I was going to say, that could be troublesome, because I don't know if you've ever gone to Disney World, but that's another place where the ticket prices have gone up, outrageously compared to 20 years ago.
So this was it was almost like I was a bit deflated after that, because this was like, look, this is like everybody who's kind of really interested in the idea that supporter-owned clubs can work were like, Portsmouth is the chance, because they've got big,
which is true democracy. It's true democracy. But they also give it back to the people.
You give back to the people. They own their own stadium, and also they've been proven to be much better financial managers of the club than the previous supposed masters of the universe who ruined the clubs. They actually paid off their debt early. They managed to save the stadium, but the upkeep of it is a very old Victorian era stadium, and they needed a lot of money. So, in the end, the fans voted to sell the club. I mean, sell the club. They didn't actually make any profit on it, because they held kind of community shares effectively. But the club was sold to Michael Eisner, who had to make a pitch to the fans to say, I'm not going to turn this into Disneyland. I'm not going to turn this, this is going to be a fans club, and said all the right things. And, a majority of the fans thought, yeah, do you know what? I want to be back in the Premier League. I want to be back there. We won the FA Cup. I want a chance to do that again. We can be back in the big time. And so all the talk I'd heard kind of withered away. And so, the fans wanted. Actually, when push came to shove, when they were given this chance, this opportunity, they decided to trust the guy again, even though they have no reason to trust anybody coming in making promises. But they thought that the chance of success again was something that was worth it. And so that was the surprising thing. It was a last minute kind of kick in the balls for me, really, both as a journalist trying to write it and as somebody who really cares about the direction that the game is going in.
Well, this will be fascinating to watch. Thank you, James, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I encourage everyone to read the Billionaires Club. It's not just for soccer players. There are fascinating themes underlying, from the poor feeding the rich, political and money equaling power. There's morality in there. I think it really underscores the increasing global inequity in wealth. And James, maybe you can just leave us with where the listener can find more about you and find your book.
Well, I'm pretty active on Twitter. So James Piotr, Jamespiotr. The Billionaires Club you can find it on Amazon.com, but it's been released in the US. So I think you can find it in Barnes & Noble and a few shops, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure where. So, but it's out there, so you can find it.
Fabulous. Thank you, James.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. What were your favorite inspired money moments? I loved how James uses soccer to access statesmen and leading politicians to write and go way beyond sport. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about soccer and its billionaires as much as I did. I never thought to follow soccer club ownership announcements as a way to gauge which countries are budding new billionaires. Check the show notes to link to James Montague and other things mentioned in this episode. And then tweet us both to let us know what you think about soccer, billionaires, and anything else discussed today. So that's it. If you don't want to miss the next Inspired Money, go to iTunes right now and hit subscribe. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review and rating. I'll be eternally grateful. Send me an email with your iTunes username and I'll mail you an autographed copy of Jim Kimo West and Ken Emerson's Slackers in Paradise. It's a great album and I'd love to share it with you. All of the music on today's show is by Jim Kimo West. Aloha, Kimo. Want to be an inspired moneymaker? Do something that scares you. Do something that's going to make you better. Do something to give back in a bigger way to the world. Tweet or email me what you're up to. Until next time, find your inspiration and run with it.